Now, a while back, we talked about starting your own campaign setting, first with Origin. Now, after you have the Origin down, one of the next things you can do is start to build your Pantheon. While this is not always a necessary step in your setting, I personally take much joy from creating my own Pantheon. An easy way to do this is stick to the basics. I think you should at least make a deity that can fit into each cleric domain, or everyone that's included in your setting, so that your players can play that. Now, domains, I think one of the things that D&D does right is that a deity is not tied to one thing, but they are encompassed in domains, such as war and such like that. And there's different ideas that they embody. For example, we have in the Greek and Roman mythologies, we have Ares, who is the god of war, but then we also have Athena, who's the god of war as well. And they have other elements to them, but that's both a piece of them. They both could also fit in like the war domain, but they're different types of war. Greeks, they hate the other one and celebrate Athena, tactical warfare, while for the Romans they're the other way around, because Ares is more win is a win, and the Romans are very militaristic culture, and that's what it comes down to for them. You could even create a monotheistic culture, but I normally do multiple, but I like the idea of this Zeus-like father figure who's the first entity, and then you have sort of tiers of godhood, how powerful they are. Pantheons can also be great to combine with the origins of your world. For example, one of my, like, you have the Zeus, and then you have the second tier, which is kind of like his main children, and one of them stole his divine clay and made these abhorrent beings, so he kind of lost his privilege to make things in the normal world and was sent to have the hells as his domain, and he wanted conflict, so he made devils and demons to fight each other. If you have a decently strong divine presence in your world, it's fun and enjoyable to make mythology and fables with your gods, stories to tell how the world came into being and how they explain things, which I think mythology is always really fun, and putting that into the world is a nice touch. It may not be important necessarily for some of your players, but it's a nice background to have, just to see how the gods interact with each other. Now, you can take from other pantheons, from Greek mythology and so on, but I like to put a twist on it. For example, you can have your traditional trickster god like Loki, but I was inspired by Constantine, who sold his soul to 3 different demonic beings, and since they realized that if he ever died, they would all fight for that and cause all at war, they made him immortal as well as giving him powers, and that's kind of how the my Loki character kind of rose to his position in the Pantheon. You want to kind of figure out how involved your gods are going to be in everyday life of your world in general. Do they interfere with the messes of mortals every other Monday? Or do they just kind of take a hands-off approach, and sometimes maybe you might not even know if they really exist or not? And that, because there's different concepts of faith. If you know that God exists, faith becomes a different thing. It's not that step of belief than it is otherwise. So is it certain in the world that gods exist, or is it not? Again, your pantheon could be any sizes. You don't really need a whole fleet and a god for everything you can name. Like I think in some worlds they have a god for like specific rivers, or you can even just have one dude or no gods at all. It's your world, but that's something you should keep in mind and know when you're creating this world. Again, there's very different ways your gods could be. They could be very aloof, superior beings who don't really feel emotion and are almost like cosmic clockwork makers who made the world and kind of sit back and watch it and then kind of make the rules of it, while otherwise you have more involved, like the Greek gods, who are flawed, and they attack each other and have these petty family disputes, and their disputes cause disruptions in the mortal world. So there's a ton of different ways. There's a total scale of the actions and involvement of the gods, which affect your world in different ways depending on how deep of an involvement or how their sort of behavior is with one another really shapes your world. Also, why are you choosing to have gods in your world? Because they should have some importance or reason why you're doing this. And if there is a reason, and like, if so, is it important to know how they interact? Probably is, with the mortal realm. In a world where gods interfere with the realms of mortals every day, maybe a god could be the antagonist of a setting, or maybe it's in a world of dying gods where they're losing power and you have these gods who ally with very powerful mortals who are desperate to regain their former glory. That definitely sets up the chances for villains or even interactions with these former godlike beings. Dying gods who use their last power to assist the players in fighting off other gods. Things like that. The gods, if they're very involved or your players are very high level, could send them off on missions. Maybe it's more based off of a theological society where church elders demand your players to go find elements, artifacts, or complete sacraments to rise up in piety and ranks, and your whole system is very like Theros, where it revolves a lot around the gods. Maybe a god is imprisoned and your whole quest is to free it or stop evil from freeing that evil god. Or it's an age after gods where they're all left and a new antagonist wants to rise up to godhood. The possibilities are endless, but you just have to choose one and go with it. Choose the involvement level, choose how many gods there is, if any, how powerful they are, and once you have that set, you can start making your gods. They could be a completely central aspect to the story, or a more side element, like the Traveler in Critical Role. When you look at different pantheons, like Greek, Egyptian, etc., what makes them different and compelling is the stories between them. Create antagonists or friendships between different gods to make stories about them and then expand on your mythology. It's very interesting if gods don't always work with each other, or some are friends and some are enemies, and that creates interesting world building and interesting interactions between different priests of different types of churches. For example, a god started out as a mortal, like my trickster god, would be hated by my death domain god Corvus because he wants to eventually consume all mortal souls or anything that had life. He wants to eventually take it, so which is why he hates immortals so much. So any mortal being who became a god, he would hate because they basically stole his chance to eventually take their soul. Maybe one child is a child of another god, like how in Greek mythology, Demeter's daughter is taken by Hades, and then, again, it depends on your world building too in stories, because she's taken during winter, so she's crying and sad during winter, which causes everything to be very bleak, and then she gets her daughter back during summer, so everything's happy again. Things to how your people explain how the world works using mythology. Also, this could make your gods have events involved with how the history was created. Maybe some god opened up a portal to hell or something and unleashed this terrible demons upon the land, and now there's this big battle, or they wanted to punish the people, so they had them have droughts and diseases. You can do all sorts of things, but this creates also different, with stories of mythologies and different things, you create holidays, potential holidays for those gods, which, again, these things will make your players have to be involved, because these holidays will inevitably happen in the cities, whether they like it or not, which means they'll be exposed to the culture of your world and therefore the mythology. Relationships between your gods will pay off for high-level campaigns, as you'll have adventure hooks with the gods if they have antagonisms with others. Also, if your players will, of course, want to have an idea of a god in mind that they will serve if they're a cleric or whatnot, and maybe some of your gods could be created that way. You are working with your players to create a god that works for them. And this is, if you're early in world building, this is where you can get started earlier, because you can create your world by collaborating with your players, which I think is really unique and cool. Now, I think if you're going to make a pantheon, you want to make your gods interesting. You don't want to just be, oh, there should be a god of fire, so I'm going to make a god of fire. Like, it should be interesting. I think similar to how Greek in Roman mythology works is that there's different aspects of the gods. It's an emphasis on ideals rather than particular things. For example, some worship Aphrodite's beauty, but there are also those who worship the gods or celebrate different aspects of them besides, because she also has other aspects to her, especially Athena. She has, there's the hunt aspect, the cunning, a strategic war. There's all these different aspects that you can worship and become a part of, not particularly for one reason at a time. And additionally, the gods will reward the people who worship in different ways too. Some, well, this is something to decide. Some will worship them for traits that they have, beauty, strength. Others for things that their actions, heroic acts of courage, pious devotion. These things are things you have to decide, how the gods decide someone's worth. Also, if your gods are very active in the mortal plane, then when your players get really strong enough, they'll want to help, because the gods, they made this creation, and now if they're active, it means that they care about the things that happen in the world. So if your players are noteworthy enough in the world, they want to interact with that, because they obviously have noticed that, and they enjoy molding the world and being active in it. You can always do kind of the bottom up, top up, where you start with the origin and some aspects of world building and stuff. Bottom down building, where you fill in the gaps with your gods, and depending on what is needed for your world or story. Once again, is there exact evidence for your gods? Maybe it could be like Ebron, where it is truly based on faith, because you're not even sure if the gods even exist or not. And this is great because it has a ton of sort of story hooks that you can do with this. For example, you have maybe some heretics that believe that the clerics are putting on a scam, that there is no gods, and in fact that the powers that they get are just arcane, but they market it off as some sort of deity. Things like that. And the players have to decide whether or not this is true by going off on sort of an adventure to find out more about this. Also, your gods don't have to affect the world just because they intervene in it. There could be certain gods that are banned in particular cities, which makes for really interesting interactions if you worship a heretic god and you're a player, because that could rub off badly, just as if your world has different racial sort of inequalities. These bring interesting sort of bumps to overcome as players with your interactions with other NPCs in the world in general. So, are your gods all-powerful, or are they even fallible? Like, someone powerful enough could even kill a god, and they have certain weaknesses. This adds more depth and diversity to the world, because maybe new gods that are rising up and popping up all the time by ascending and stuff like that, but also old gods are being brought down, and so the Pantheon's always changing. The gods have legendary artifacts and champions who they imbibe their main powers into, almost like demigods. Also, is there mortal manifestations of the gods? If so, what do they look like? And maybe if they see this character multiple times, who helps them mysteriously, maybe they're God, and they can pick up on this because they look the same each time. Is there mechanics in place based off of your religion? Is there some sort of piety system? Maybe you have a prayer mechanic where every time they pray to their god, there's a 1% chance they'll interact, or things like that. If the gods help them, is there a price or not? There's also a lot more flavor stuff you can add, like if they have holy symbols, what do they look like? What are their different like slogans, like leave a place brighter than you found it, or from death comes life. Basic concepts which followers spread around to give a brief description of their god's goal and teachings. You can also create warlock patrons. These are one of my favorite. Warlock patrons are often really unique and cool. For example, they could be disgraced gods, some that were part of the original Pantheon, but were cast away by being maybe too radical or by going against its code. You could have other entities that rose up in godhood, or eldritch horrors that weren't part of the main Pantheon originally. These are so fun to create. What's great about warlock patrons is they normally have a much more involved role in your player's life, because they're not as powerful, they don't have many followers, so they'll focus their power on those who follow them. And since there's this price to be paid, they demand something in return. Not all deities outside of the main pantheon need to be evil necessarily. Maybe there is, like, for example, in my world, there are demi-thralls, which are basically servants to the gods that have certain demigod-like powers. Now, one of them was accused of basically being going against its code or whatnot, but it was actually another demi-thrall who was jealous and set them up for failure. Now they're cast out, and they help those who have been wronged by the legal system or the gods themselves. Expand greatly on your story and add interesting things like, oh, we don't want you to know about this god because of this. If they do, then this will, you know, put bad light on the main gods, like those who were cast out for being too radical, and things like that, which add interesting story elements as well. Some, of course, are bad. Like one demi-thrall type being who was in love with one of the actual gods, but was spurned, causing him to turn to the sort of trickster god in order to gain power. And now his followers have these kind of quirks where they meet together at these masquerades and wear masks, and have these sort of cult-like ceremonies. Also, similar to, you know, the Greek mythology Prometheus Titan figure, I have one of those who's a one of those alternate entities as well, who basically, after the gods wanted soul power, so they got rid of all the Titan-like beings because they were competing with them for the attention of the mortals. But now one of them, after being weakened for so long, has returned, and he wants to fight against the gods and regain the love and praise of his people, which he thinks are his, not the original pantheons. One of them in my pantheon is actually a mistake. The original creator god, at first when he tried to create like lesser deities, he messed up, and we have this malformed one which now wants to exact vengeance. Mortal who performed a ceremony to ascend to godhood that went wrong, like the Raven Queen. Maybe one of your gods in the pantheon was replaced by a former god who's now vying to reobtain power. There's so many ways to make outcast beings interesting, and they're always really unique and interesting. So if you're not going to create like a whole world or anything, I would say try to create like a warlock patron if your character's into that, because for me it's a ton of fun. So this is my video on pantheons. Thank you for watching.